So, episode 5 of Netflix's Mr. McMahon documentary, this is called Family Business, which is where they're going to be talking about how the McMahon family sort of came up and their dynamics and how they went from just being behind the scenes with only Vince being on TV to eventually Vince, Linda, Shane, and Stephanie being regular characters. Now, it's a little bit misleading because a lot of this documentary focuses on the events, which I understand why, because these events were huge events historically for Vince and for WWE from around the late 90s to the early 2000s. This would cover the company going public. It would cover the death of WCW and the purchase of WCW by WWE. It covered the departure of Rock and Austin and the issues they had briefly. It actually talked a lot about the return of Hulk Hogan, which I wasn't expecting. Like, they devoted a lot of time to the return of Hulk Hogan and to the Hogan Rock match. And while that was a big match, in no way am I denying that. I guess it was done to illustrate Vince and how he's willing to forgive even guys that go against him, because they showed a montage of Eric Bischoff and Bret Hart and guys who were vocal against Vince coming back. So I legitimately believed that this part was going to talk about the Chris Benoit. That's what I said in my review for episode 4. They didn't get there. In fact, the latest they got in the timeline, with the exception of the last couple of minutes that are teasing part 6, which is the whole Janelle Grant thing. But the latest they got in the timeline here was like the rise of John Cena. Because they talked about the Ruthless Aggression era, and they talked about sort of the changes that were made and the rise of Batista, Lesnar, but it really harped in on John Cena and the whole story. Again, like I said in previous, with episodes 3, 4, and 5, if you know these stories, if you've been a hardcore fan, you already know about John Cena rapping in the back of a bus to Stephanie McMahon. You already know about the XFL failing. They actually showed footage of the Bob Costas interview, and Costas himself talked about how the WWF and WWE did have polished products and XFL just wasn't that. And they talked about how the XFL was a huge deal the first week, but then fell apart. Now, again, there have already been documentaries made on the XFL. You know, this documentary series is now feeling a bit more like a best of other documentaries. And now, again, this goes to how much you know, because Netflix is a big, international streaming service. There's going to be people outside the U.S. who don't know any of this. There's going to be people who are casual fans, or people who maybe watched in the Attitude Era for a few months or a few years. Maybe they watched in the Hogan era and they're checking this out, right? That all makes sense. This could be for them. But for somebody like myself, and I mentioned more hardcore fans, these stories are stories that you've heard of before. Like, for example, they actually address for the first time publicly. No, actually, it may not have been the first time. I think they talked about it on the McMahon documentary, that Vince wanted to do an incest angle with Stephanie. That was actually discussed on this, and he kind of laughed it off, but again, that's a little weird. Real or fake, it's weird, because that's his real daughter. It's not an actress. They talked about the whole, in the early part of the documentary, I'm going to get to what I was going to say in a minute. They talked about the family structure and how Shane and Stephanie wanted to be in the business and how Vince sort of dragged them through the ringer. And then they talk a lot, more than I was expecting, about that infamous 2001 storyline where Vince was having an affair with Trish Stratus and made her bark like a dog. All of that stuff was covered. But these are things that, again, have been covered before. The Mr. McMahon documentary, the documentary series on Ruthless Aggression, some of that was in here. These topics aren't new to, like, long-term fans. So that's why I noticed that there were some people that were saying that a lot of this information is stuff that we already knew. But I still have curiosity to see what is unveiled. And there was a couple things in this episode that were very surprising. So, first of all, I want to say there was a little bit of manipulative editing again, because they're talking about the Shane Vince match at WrestleMania 17. And they're interviewing them about the match, and they're saying, I was nervous to hit my father and this and that. But that wasn't the first match they had against each other. Far from it. The first time that Vince and Shane wrestled each other was in 99. I think it was like May of 99 on Raw. And they had a really good match. It was like a knockdown, drag out fight. For two guys who are not pro wrestlers, not trained, like pros for years and years and years, they went in there and had a pretty, like, violent match on Raw. And it's enjoyable to watch. But they kind of played it up like this was their first match. And it could have been editing or it could have been they don't remember. Either way, because one of the things about this documentary, and this was discussed recently by Brian Alvarez, is that McMahon had handlers with him that were there reminding him of things. And this episode really, really showed that. We didn't see the handlers. The story was that Vince had handlers there to remind him of things he did, but there was a point where they bring up the Sable lawsuit, how Sable sued them and then later came back, and they ask him about the character of Mr. McMahon having an affair with Sable, and he doesn't remember. And I don't even think he's lying. I genuinely do not think he's lying. He's an old man who's lived a long life and done a lot of things. Remember, this is not like a regular old man who just works his whole life and raises a family and that's it. This man traveled the world, lived in luxury, has been to every continent, many countries, has, been in front of the public eye most of his life. And when you have a life like that, even Steve Austin himself talks about how, I was running hard. When you live a life of like a rock star like that, there's a lot of things that people forget. So I can't even say he's lying about it, but he had forgotten all about the Sable lawsuit, which was part of the storyline. They even showed the footage of Stephanie on TV, on SmackDown, bringing it up to Vince. Now, again, that was unexpected. That was very unexpected. Now, the segment that was the most eye-opening, in my opinion, was the last maybe 20 minutes or so. And this is about the Vince and Shane relationship, because they discussed how Shane wanted to be a part of the business and he felt like Vince had taken over from Vince Sr., that he would eventually take over from Vince. And so the whole story is that Shane wanted to take over. He wanted succession and Vince wouldn't give it to him. He just wouldn't give it to him. And this led to Shane leaving the company, and he wouldn't come back till 2016. And they didn't go into like the fact that Shane went to China to start a company. Like, that's something that had gotten out, during those times, that's what he was doing. But the idea was, okay, if I can't inherit WWE from my father, I'm going to go start my own thing. It wasn't a wrestling company, but he eventually came back. And they discussed this complicated relationship. And Vince himself just sort of behaves in a very strange way, because he's basically saying, he would tell, like Brian Gewirtz, who was the head writer from 2001-ish to around 2012, he talked about how Vince would oftentimes humiliate Shane and Stephanie for the bad ideas they would come up with, which may not have even been bad ideas, but Vince thought they were, because he put them through the ringer. And some of the people interviewed were questioning that relationship. Like, what kind of a weird relationship do Vince and Shane have? Because it's almost like Vince chastises his own son while also like loving him. It's very weird. It's almost like, I'm not going to sit here and say that Vince has narc tendencies, although there is a fair bit of narcissism there, because he just would not give up the company to his son. And there's a very, very bone-chilling story that Paul Heyman tells here about an argument between Vince and Shane, where Vince tells Shane, if you want to take over this, put that knife in my heart. And I'm not gonna try and do the impression. You have to see this part of the documentary. Like, I will tell you, like, even if you're a hardcore wrestling fan, even if you know most of these stories, right, you have to see that part of the documentary, because it was chilling. Like, the way that Vince was almost telling Shane, and if you don't kill me, then you're not man enough, because I would have done that to my father. Like, just real insane, like batshit crazy. Like, when people say that Vince is batshit crazy, there's even a segment where, and I don't remember if it was in this episode or the previous episode, it may have been the previous episode, where they talked about, is Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon the same person? And a lot of people, including even Bruce Pritchard, were like, no, that they're very close. And Bruce would talk about how Vince himself has lost his temper and said things to Bruce that he has said on camera to his enemy wrestlers in the storylines, right? So it makes you wonder about Vince's sanity. And I've talked in the past about Vince was not a silver spoon baby in the sense of his early childhood. He lived with his mom and his stepdad. And actually, they once again bring up the Playboy interview that Vince did, and they bring up the sexual abuse. And Vince straight up talks about how it was incest. There was incest involved. And when you are sexually abused by your own mother, and it's incest, I mean, I am not a therapist, but I can only imagine the amount of damage is done to this guy. Like I said in my episode 1 review, hurt people hurt people. And maybe Vince's strange fetishes that we saw in those text messages that came out earlier this year, maybe this is where it all started, man. And they don't go too deep into that. I really wanted them to explore that, and I really wanted them to have Vince tell us, like, I'm not saying to actually make them go through what actually happened step by step. We can assume it was bad, but sort of question, like, did this shape who you are? And at one point they sort of do, and then Vince's whole mentality was, you get over it, you move on. He's one of those kind of guys that he's always looking toward the future, not the past. And I kind of admire that, because I don't have that skill. You know, I oftentimes, and I know many of you are the same, we dwell on the past. We have anxiety because we're worried about the future because of events that have happened to us in the past. And I've gone to therapy and I've worked through it. You know, but it still creeps up on us. We're humans. But Vince is the kind of guy who, even when they talk about him buying WCW here, and he's like, you know, I wasn't really cheering because I always assumed I was going to win. It might sound egotistical, but I always thought I was going to win, which is kind of confident. And then he's like, but when I won, it wasn't like I was celebrating. We just move on. Like, he just keeps moving forward, which that's not something that Vince is just blowing smoke up his ass. Vince Russo has talked about this. Brian Gewirtz has talked about this. Jim Ross, other wrestlers. That is Vince McMahon. That is the real Vince McMahon. If something bad happens, you don't sell it, or maybe you do privately, and you move on to the next thing. When the XFL went under, this documentary or this episode covers it. He's like, what's going on with Raw? Like, he has to just keep moving. And that's admirable. It's weird, but it is admirable. It's an admirable trait. That's something that I wish I could do sometimes. So I like that honesty, that honesty from Vince, because, you know, this documentary is probably going to end up not being what I wanted it to be. I haven't watched episode 6 yet. I'll let you know then, because they kind of tease that that's going to be when we get the Janelle Grant stuff. But still, like, I will tell you that it's not what I was hoping it would be necessarily. But I do think that Vince has never been more honest. I think, and I'm not saying that he's not lying about these things. I'm saying I don't think he's ever been this forward with some of these topics. I mean, he's the one who discusses and laughs about the incest angle. You know, they briefly also discussed Triple H actually getting with Stephanie, and that story that Vince wanted to put the real wedding on pay-per-view. You know, they went over all of that in this episode, because this episode was mostly focused on family. At least for the first, like, maybe 20 minutes it was, and then it went into this whole, like, the death of WCW, the company going public. It went into that. And then, by the end, it kind of circled back around to the Shane thing. And, you know, they actually went over why Shane left the company. And the whole thing was he felt like the battles with Vince were going to boil over, that he was going to explode. And Vince himself says something very insightful. He says, don't bring your family into your business, which I have heard that from many, many business people. That it is a big mistake to involve your family in your business because of conflicts like this. There's, you know, when you have family members, they tend to take advantage of you sometimes, or you have a soft spot for them, and it becomes difficult because if family members work for you, you're going to have employees that think there's nepotism involved. Like, it does cause more conflicts when you have family members working for you. It definitely does. And when Stephanie first took over creative, I remember a lot of people on the internet were criticizing that. I was just dipping my toes into the internet back then. And they were like, well, he's never going to fire his own daughter, which is true. He never did. So overall, this episode was a step up from the last two. I do think it was a step up from the previous two episodes. Most of the stuff, again, has been covered before, but there were some really intriguing things about that family dynamic. And I do really wish they would have gone into that more. Like, if they would have cut out all of the, which it's tough to cut out all of the WWE going public and stuff, because that's going to tie in later with their eventual sale to Endeavor. But speaking of which, on here they also talk about how Shane wanted to buy the UFC, which was true. And Vince didn't want to buy it. But his excuse was he didn't want to buy it because we create characters. And you can do that in UFC. The most popular people in UFC are characters. Brock Lesnar is a character. Anderson Silva was a character. Conor McGregor is a hell of a character. Ronda Rousey, like the most popular fighters, Mike Tyson, are characters. But the story that I remember is that the reason as to why Vince did not want to buy UFC is because he couldn't work the outcomes. In other words, they were real fights and he didn't want to bother spending the money. And at one point he even says, like, why don't you buy it? Why don't you buy me out, Shane? So it almost becomes a situation where Vince is like, I'm not saying Vince doesn't love Shane, because I can't read that man's mind. He's a very complicated man. But it's almost like he always wants Shane to be beneath him. He could never actually give up the company to Shane, which a lot of folks thought was going to happen. Some thought it was going to be Stephanie. And for a while, Shane and Stephanie were going to take over. And then sometime around 2019-ish is when the rumor started going around that he wanted to sell the company and not have the family take over. And that was an interesting, revelation to a lot of people, because they thought, well, Triple H did such a good job with NXT, he'll take over with Stephanie and that'll be that. And that's not what happened. Well, it is what happened, but not in the way that it happened. Endeavor bought him out. And then Triple H is still there now as the head chief content officer, head of creative, and Nick Khan's the CEO. So Nick Khan basically took Stephanie's job. But Stephanie is still in good spirits with the company. I can only imagine how strange things are now, with this whole lawsuit and the craziness surrounding it. I don't know. We'll find out in episode 6. What are your comments and thoughts on episode 5? Let me know in the comments down below, please. And I'll be back with episode 6 probably tomorrow. If not today, probably tomorrow. I'll let you know, because I might put this up on Thursday and then just finish it off on Friday. Anyways, have a good one.